Hello, I'm Sarang Shidore, Director of Studies at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, welcoming you to this event. The Quincy Institute is an action-oriented foreign policy think tank based in Washington that promotes ideas that move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and towards vigorous diplomacy in the pursuit of international peace. Our vision is a world where peace is the norm and war the exception. The tragic war in Ukraine continues to escalate with all its suffering that Ukrainian civilians are going through. The events in Europe seem to be only worsening the frictions with Russia and China that we are told signify a new strategic competition between autocracies and democracies. At the crossroads of the U.S. China dynamic in particular sits Southeast Asia, a region of 680 million people with a GDP of nearly 10 trillion in purchasing power parity terms. It contains the world's fourth largest country, Indonesia, by population, and also a country among the world's richest, that is Singapore. The United States has a lot of goodwill in Southeast Asia. It is a top investor there. It also relies strongly on supply chains that are deeply interwoven through the region. In addition, two treaty allies, Philippines and Thailand, are also located in Southeast Asia. With all of this, Southeast Asian perspectives and lessons can be very valuable here in the United States, particularly as the US deals with Asia and with China in particular. So today we are here because we have a very interesting discussion ahead of us and a very distinguished panel to analyze all of this. And I'm going to start with the introductions here with our first panelist, our first guest, who is Dr. Elina Noor. Welcome, Elina Noor. You are a Director of Political Security Affairs and Deputy Director, Washington office at the Asia Society Policy Institute. You were born in Malaysia, and your work focuses on security developments in Southeast Asia, global governance and technology, and also countering violent extremism. You have been Director, Foreign Policy and Security Studies at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies in Malaysia. You were also formerly with the Brookings Institutions project on US relations with the Islamic world. Between 2017 and 2019, you were a member of the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. And you currently serve on the ICRC's Global Advisory Board on Digital Threats during conflict. And I should also mention that one of your areas of specialization is technology, how it affects Southeast Asia and its geostrategic implications. So we are very, very glad to have you on this panel, Elina. Our second guest is Ambassador Dino Pati Jalal from Indonesia. Welcome, Ambassador Jalal, to this event. You as well have had a very distinguished career as an Indonesian diplomat. You were Indonesian ambassador to the United States from 2010 to 2013, during which you played a key role in elevating the US-Indonesia bilateral relationship to a comprehensive partnership. You also served as Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs and ran for President of Indonesia. So, and currently I believe you are the Senior Advisor for the Asia Group based in Indonesia, and you provide strategic advice and counsel for companies who are trying to navigate the complexities and the challenges of doing business in Indonesia. So wonderful to have you on this event, Ambassador Jalal.
Great to be here. Thank you.
And But one more thing, our panel today is also special because it's not just a panel discussing Southeast Asia. It's also a panel to mark a new partnership that the Quincy Institute has launched with the Asian Peace Program at the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. And this organization, the Asian Peace Program, is led by Professor Kishore Mahbubani, who is right here and is our third panelist. So welcome, Kishore, very much to this event. And we are so glad to have you join us on this special day.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Great. So you yourself, of course, need a little introduction. You're a global thinker, writer, scholar, former diplomat. You're currently a distinguished fellow at the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. Before that, you were a diplomat and ambassador for your country, Singapore, for 33 years, a long innings. And in that capacity, you served twice as Singapore's ambassador to the United Nations and also president of the UN Security Council. You were then founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore, and then also selected as one of Foreign Policy publications' top global thinkers in 2010 and 2011. And in addition to all that, you also written, I believe, is it 8 books. So wonderful to have you not just on the panel, but also as a partner with the Quincy Institute. So before we get started on our topic, I wanted to sort of just ask you, Kishore, about the Asian Peace Program and how you see our partnership as benefiting our common goals between the Quincy Institute and the APP for peace and stability in Asia.
Thank you very much, Sarang, for inviting us to join you in Singapore in the morning, for you in the evening. I think it's very clear that the prospects for Asia in the 21st century are phenomenal. And we will see basically a return to the natural order of the world, where China and India will once again have the largest economies of the world. So the 21st century will be completely different from the 19th and 20th centuries. But to get there, it's very important that Asia remains peaceful. And that's why peace is basically a priority in this region. And as you know, this region actually has seen some of the biggest wars since World War II. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Sino-Vietnam War, you name them. So for this region to basically be at peace now for essentially 40 years has been quite a remarkable achievement. But it's an achievement that cannot be taken for granted. And that's why it's very important to launch something like the Asian Peace Program.
That's wonderful. I of course, agree with that. And I think the partnership has a lot of potential in bringing diverse Southeast Asian voices to Washington, and indeed bringing some of Washington's perspectives to Southeast Asia as well. So
let me quickly add, of course, we all want to see the United States maintain a strong presence in East Asia, and therefore, in a sense, having a partnership with an institution in the United States is actually quite natural and something that's desirable in this region.
Indeed, indeed. I'm going to just stay with you for a minute and actually start with the big global crisis that is rocking Washington, Europe, and indeed the world. And we all know what that is. That is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And all of that is causing in the region, the world, and one cannot imagine that Asia is unaffected by it, especially if this crisis continues. So I wanted to understand this from your perspective. Here in Washington, we are seeing increasingly the mention of China in this conversation. The questions are being raised about China's relations with Russia, and the demands are being made that China must distance itself from Russia because, of course, Russia's war is an illegal invasion and against a violation of the UN Charter. Now, how do you see this? Do you see any dangers here in US-Asia ties if this dynamic or this trend continues to progress in this manner?
Well, number one, I mean, I have to emphasize that, like the rest of the world, Southeast Asia was equally shocked by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Is clearly a violation of international law, and therefore, out of the 10 ASEAN states, as you know, 8 supported the UN General Assembly resolution, which condemned the invasion of Ukraine. So on the matter of principle, I think you'll find that Southeast Asia stands with the rest of the world. But at the same time, I think there's an equally strong concern in this region that we are just coming out of COVID-19. And frankly, 2022 was supposed to be the year when our economies bounce back and life would go back to normal. And now, just as we thought we are coming out of the tunnel of COVID-19, suddenly we have another major disruption, which is Ukraine. So there's also a lot of fundamental concern that the Ukraine crisis not disrupt this region, at least. And, you know, in the case of US and China relations, I mean, it's understandable why the United States will want to try and push China towards joining the Western pressure on Russia. But I suspect that if the United States could step into China's shoes and see the world from China's perspective, I think the Chinese are hard-headed realists. They know that even if they went all out with the United States in putting pressure on Russia, there'll be no gratitude after this over. And in fact, what would happen is that if Russia is eliminated for whatever reason, then the U.S. China geopolitical contest, which will, you know, as you know, I document this in my book as China One, will definitely gain momentum in the next 10 to 20 years. So you can understand, therefore, why while China clearly has not in any way supported or endorsed the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it is, of course, at the same time reluctant to join a campaign to weaken Russia, because at the end of the day, having Russia as an independent pole in a multipolar world is something that will suit China's strategic interests. So every country will look after its own strategic interests. And so the Chinese are trying to walk a very careful middle path on the Ukraine issue. And I would also argue very quickly that it may actually be in America's national interests to see Russia walk down the middle path, by the way, together with India. Both China and India are walking the middle path, so that they could possibly act as intermediaries and reach out to Russia if we ever need to find a kind of negotiated solution.
Indeed. I mean, we know that Israel has offered itself as an intermediary, but there can be other candidates. And you do mention these two important countries that could play that role. I want to turn next to Elena to try and understand her perspective. Elena, you were born in Malaysia, and you have a perspective from there, but also from Washington at the same time. So if you can tell us a little bit about how, from your perspective, Southeast Asia is looking at this, and especially the fact that Southeast Asia is a very dynamic, growing economy with many advances or potentials, let's say, in technology and growth. And these sorts of geopolitical tensions with Russia and China in the mix surely are causing great worry in Malaysia and elsewhere in the region.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we saw those tensions already starting to almost calcify prior to the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And there was already worry in Southeast Asia about how these intensifying tensions were going to impact upon what Southeast Asia often posits to be its digital future. There's a lot of buzz, there's a lot of excitement about all things tech in Southeast Asia, but there were concerns about supply chain continuity, there were concerns about the splitting of the internet fragmentation, and there were also concerns about how there might be differing standards and governance frameworks related to technology in Southeast Asia, particularly with what seemed to be this adamant move towards tech decoupling between the US and China. But Russia is also a key, though low-key player in the tech space in Southeast Asia. And Russia has actually been an intellectual thought leader in cyberspace governance. If you look at the UN platforms, the UN Group of Governmental Experts on Cyberspace, the actual name is a lot longer, but it's the UN Group of Governmental Experts that looks at the governance and the rules of the road, how states should behave in cyberspace. The initial concept was mooted way back in 2004 by Russia. And Russia has played a key role in trying to move this agenda forward. The US came in a little later, but what we saw a few years ago, just about 2017, was when a split happened within the UN system. Russia sort of championed one way and the US championed another way. As a result, there were two parallel UN processes related to cyberspace governance. But there's been so much attention that's been paid to China and what China is doing in the tech space. We often forget that there are these other players. And Southeast Asia is also in the mix because of this technological excitement with business investing, with governments coming up with all sorts of policy and with an expanding consumer base related to tech in Southeast Asia. So the challenge for Southeast Asia, and we can unpack this a little later, is for the region to assert some sort of meaningful agency in this jostled space between the major powers. There's often this binary that's painted between the US and China, but we also forget that there is actually space for some of the quote unquote smaller actors that can actually have meaningful agency in carving out its own digital futures, for example.
Indeed, this is a very important point. We're going to come back to this because the idea of Southeast Asia as an autonomous actor, as an actor with agency, is very important. This is especially in a time when we just talk great powers. Sometimes in Washington, there are other players and other actors, and Washington should account for them perhaps more. I want to turn now to Ambassador Jalal, and picking up actually on Elina's point on this agency question. Indonesia is in some sense not a great power, but it is actually a very large country. People forget that it is the fourth largest country in the world after the United States, after China, India, and the United States in terms of population. So I'm trying to get to Indonesia's understanding of the Ukraine crisis and where it stands in the great power competition framework, so to speak. We know that Indonesia voted with the United States and the UN General Assembly on the resolution condemning Russia. But it also, since then, President Jokowi has made a statement calling for a ceasefire and also saying that both Ukraine and Russia are friends of Indonesia. So clearly, Indonesia is taking a nuanced position here. So could you explain the interests and logic behind this and what the US can understand and learn from this?
First, thank you for inviting me to this forum, Sarang. We were all shocked, like Kishore said, about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because we thought he was just bluffing. It was just intimidation tactics. We never thought Putin had it in him to launch an all-out land, sea, and air invasion on such a massive scale on Ukraine. So we were really all caught off guard. With Crimea, we didn't really pay much attention. But on Ukraine, clearly has crossed the line and is a major international conflict and definitely a violation of international law and the UN Charter. Right? The two things that concerns Indonesia also, one is the ethnic dimension. Russia supported two separatist regions based on ethnic lines. And for Indonesia, our foreign policy has always been very sensitive on ethnic separatism. We have a long history of it, and we worry about what the president would be coming from the Russian support of the ethnic separatists in Lutan and Donbass. Yeah. So that's one. The second thing is that this is the biggest foreign policy year for President Jokowi because he's hosting the G20, right? So there's a lot riding on it. I mean, the domestic campaign on Indonesia's prestige of chairing the G20 has been really enormous. And the worry is that how will this make G20 dysfunctional? And there are signs already at the working level that that's becoming so, and that threatens the ability of G20 in November in Indonesia to reach any meaningful results. And the other thing I want to mention is for some reason, Indonesia has not named Russia, right? So it's done so in the UN GA resolution, but the rhetorics of the president and of the foreign minister has really avoided mentioning Russia in this and have somewhat remained ambivalent. Yeah, I think that is a function of the need to try to play a meaningful role in the G20, because Indonesia still wants Russia to take an active part in it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I sort of want to now get beyond a little bit beyond Ukraine and actually turn to Elena Noor again and try to get at this development that's been going on for some time now. The development of creating new minilaterals or groupings of a small number of countries in Asia, with the U.S. as a part of them. And we have seen, of course, the Quad that has emerged in its second innings since 2017. But more recently, last year, we have seen the emergence of this military pact called AUKUS, a pact between Australia, United States, and the UK to build nuclear submarines, but it's really more than that. It's also about defense technology cooperation. There's a lot of technological elements in AUKUS. So my question on AUKUS is related to the responses that came from the region on AUKUS. Indonesia and Malaysia in particular criticized in a sort of sophisticated way, but criticized AUKUS. Other countries had some slightly different responses, but overall, there does seem to me to be a sort of wariness in Southeast Asia about AUKUS. So, assuming this is true, what sort of policy responses can Southeast Asia offer in a way that communicates their concerns and actually achieves some results? Difficult as it is in this situation. Can you see any of that happening, and what could those be?
Yeah, as you probably know, Sarang, there was a range of responses, in particular to AUKUS, and I think Malaysia and Indonesia came out perhaps a little stronger than the other countries in Southeast Asia did. But Indonesia and Malaysia said their piece and then moved on, right? And in the case of Malaysia, actually, the cooperation with the AUKUS countries continued. In fact, Malaysia was hosting the FPDA around the same time. And so despite the reservations that were expressed behind the scenes and even publicly, the cooperation with these countries has remained quite strong. I think perhaps the way AUKUS was communicated was perhaps a little tone deaf to the region, given its colonial encounters with some of these countries. But I think you're right. There has to be some sort of engagement with these AUKUS countries, particularly with the Quad as well, the renewed focus on all things tech, right? So if you look at the Quad statements, if you look at AUKUS, there is going to be even greater attention paid to what they call critical and emerging technologies, things like AI, cyber, quantum. So with AUKUS, the submarine deal is only the first in a chain of science and tech developments that are in the pipeline. So what can Southeast Asia do? Well, I think several things. Persuasion through diplomacy, better communication, I think, will reduce misunderstanding, distrust between parties, but also participation in some of these initiatives in a way that benefits all sides if possible. That's not always going to be the case. I'm not naive, but if Southeast Asian countries can again assert their agency proactively through participating in some of these tech-related developments, that can help to strengthen the capabilities and capacity of Southeast Asian states with the know-how from AUKUS or Quad countries, but also create that sense of empowerment and agency among Southeast Asian states to be a part of the rules making related to these technologies that are evolving. I think often in Southeast Asia, we're called rule takers, not really rule makers. And it's time that we step up and help craft those rules, because a lot of countries are looking at Southeast Asia as this fulcrum of sorts. But we can't just simply sit back and be reactive. So there has to be proactive participation in order to assert that agency that we like to talk about. Agency doesn't just come out of the blue, right? It has to be cultivated, and it has to be asserted with empowerment.
Right. So on this question of agency, now I want to Kishore, please.
Yeah. You said we should also try to have a conversation with each other.
Please.
So I thought I'd chip in and compliment what Alina said, and I completely agree with her about the need for the Southeast Asian states to also have agency. Now, as you know, I said earlier that one point I want to emphasize is that the region wants to see a strong United States presence in this region. But it also wants to see a strong United States presence that actually understands this region. And I believe that one of the flaws in American policy towards East Asia is that it gets basically two things wrong. Firstly, the whole ASEAN approach, and I hope Dino will speak after me, is one that realizes that whether you like it or not, China has been a neighbor of Southeast Asia for the past 2,000 years. China will be a neighbor of Southeast Asia for the next 2,000 years. We have to live with China. Let's be very clear about that. So all the arrangements, therefore, that ASEAN is proposing are actually intended to include China rather than exclude China. And when American initiatives try to focus on what they can do to exclude China from this region, I think that's a fundamental mistake, because there'll be no takers in this region. So even though the ASEAN-centered processes that Dino and I actually have worked on as diplomats are messy, are slow, are difficult, at the end of the day, the ASEAN-centered processes have achieved the most important thing, which is they've achieved peace and prosperity for this region. So therefore, it would be wiser for the United States to work with the inclusive ASEAN approach rather than to try and create alternatives that bypass ASEAN, that marginalize ASEAN, that weaken ASEAN. And that, I think, is a fundamental mistake that Washington, D.C. may be making in dealing with East Asia. And the second flaw in the U.S. approach is that it doesn't realize the real game in East Asia is economics. And here in 2022, even though everyone is focused on the war in Ukraine, which of course is a world-changing event, an even bigger world-changing event occurred in January 2022 when the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the world's largest free trade agreement, was launched. And that's really going to change the texture and chemistry of the world. So therefore, what the United States should do is put forward its own economic initiatives. And as you know, everyone in this region agrees that it was a mistake for the United States to leave the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a mistake for the United States not to return to the comprehensive partnership that succeeded the TPP. And therefore, if the game is economic, come back and play the economic game. And that's much more important than having an arrangement to rent submarines to each other. You know, that arrangement to rent submarines is not going to change the needle of history. It's the economic arrangements that are going to change that. So that's I think those are the two fundamental changes that Washington, D.C. needs to understand, because I want to emphasize we want to see a strong U.S. presence here.
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah.
Please.
Yes.
Dino.
Well, you know, Indonesia has decided that China is going to be a big part of our future for the country and also for the region. Yeah. So if we chart what's Indonesia going to be in the next 20, 30 years, China wasn't very much part of it in the previous decades. But from this point on, definitely China, I think, figures one of the largest countries that will have impact and opportunity for Indonesia. I think one of the more interesting surveys that we did at FPCI was the public perception on the United States and America. We asked the public who would be the most important countries for Indonesia. In the past few years, the answer had always been in the United States. But 2 or 3 years ago, for the first time, the answer shifted to China. And when we asked the question, who would be the most important countries for the future? In the past, the question had always been the United States, but then it moved to China. It doesn't mean that China's image is all positive, but there's that recognition that China is a big part of our future. And that's part of the reasons of Indonesia's response to AUKUS. First, that we were not informed about it. We were caught off guard, yeah. And, we thought we should have been better informed by our partners, by Australia and by United States, yeah. But secondly, there was a sense that this was something with China in mind, right? So China loomed large in the background of this, and we were not comfortable with this because a Quad already was being perceived as something that would exclude China or targeted at China. And comments by Secretary Pompeo at the end of his term cemented that perception. Yeah. So we thought, oh, not another one, because the effectiveness of ASEAN, the so-called ASEAN centrality, relies on our ability to engage effectively all the great powers. We can't be against any one power at the behest of another power, right? So we need to engage everybody: the United States, China, Russia, Japan, Europe. So that's what worried us at first about AUKUS and to some extent the Quad.
Is Indonesia likely to join the Quad or associate with it in some fashion? What's your sense?
No, I don't see any sign of it at all. I know we were, I don't know if I should call invited, but we've been asked about that same question at the official level many times. But I think there was a perception if Indonesia joined the Quad, Indonesia would be leaving ASEAN, would be stepping ahead of ASEAN. And Indonesia is much more likely in the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific and staying within ASEAN on the Indo-Pacific.
Right. I want to take a pause here and tell the audience that please put in your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Some of you have done that. Others who are not aware, please do that. We will pick up those questions during the rest of the show. I wanted to get back to all of you, actually, depending on who wants to answer this. But the point that Kishore made about the lack of an economic game, I think it's a very important point, because this is something Southeast Asian states, in my perception, have been saying this for some time. This is not a new thing. But yet, when we see these strategy documents come out of Washington, like we just saw the Indo-Pacific strategy come out, it has language about economics, but doesn't have anything concrete. Now, of course, the US is the biggest investor, one of the biggest, certainly in Southeast Asia. It has a strong relationship with the region economically. But what sort of things are Southeast Asian states expecting beyond the private sector engagement that continues, that will continue? But what are they expecting from the government in terms of an economic strategy? Can all of you or some of you give some specific examples of that?
Well, I'll just start, and I say, it's the easiest way for the United States is to rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because at the end of the day, that agreement,
So, Kishore, I don't want to interrupt you, but I'm going to, because the reality of politics in the United States right now is that joining a big trade agreement is off the table. This is just a reality in Congress. So
Yes.
if you take that into account, is there something that you can suggest to your friends here in Washington?
But that, you see, you just identified the problem brilliantly, absolutely brilliantly, because what is off the table in Washington, D.C. is what needs to be on the table in East Asia if you want to play the game. And if you want to have a winning strategy, and if you want to ensure that in a world where China's economy becomes #1 in the world, and if you want to ensure that you retain a significant amount of influence in this region, then keep on sending your aircraft carriers, keep on sending your submarines. It will not change the course of history in this region. So therefore, that's exactly the problem. What is considered off the table in Washington, D.C. needs to be put on the table if you want a result 10 years from 20 years from now that you like. Because if you keep it off the table, 10 to 20 years, you will see the consequences and you will not like the consequences.
Yeah, and I want to add to that. Thank you, Pak Kishore. What we in Indonesia worry about is with the Russia-Ukraine crisis, the strategic tussle between the West and Russia, and maybe to some degree China will reach a new level. And what if that is being transplanted into the Indo-Pacific? That is not in our interests. I think Pak Kishore wrote a viral article recently on that, on the strategic culture of Asia, which should be rather different. So what we see is possibly the attempts to transplant that strategic tussle into the Indo-Pacific, while China's economic engagement with the region is really unmatched. And that's what is shaping political influence and a greater engagement between countries in the region. I'll just tell you one example. When I was ambassador to the United States, trade was about 27 billion. This was 10 years ago. And it remains around that level now at about 28, 29 billion. With China, it used to be 40 billion, now it's 100 billion during the pandemic, right? So 3 times more than Indonesia trade with the US, right? So clearly something China is doing a lot better. We want greater US economic engagement in the region. I agree with Pak Kishore. And Secretary Tony Blinken talked about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework when he came to the region, and we like that. And we hope that will be furnished with more concrete program, because the perception in the region is that US doesn't play an important part on infrastructure building. And whereas China with the Belt and Road is all about infrastructure, and they have the resources, they have the models on how to do it. But on the US side, infrastructure is very lacking, and it seems that the US private sector is not interested in taking part in the infrastructure building of the Indo-Pacific economies.
Wonderful. Elena, I want you to address this as well, especially the technology side, but also the infrastructure and other points that have come up. How would you say, what would be the specifics that you would like from Washington?
Yeah, I was going to offer my 2 Malaysian cent, which is probably not worth very much, but for what it's worth, I think, so I lost many nights of sleep working on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as it was then known, for the for the Malaysian National Interest Analysis Assessment. And it was really hoped that the agreement would materialize because there were external pressures that were needed for Southeast Asian economies to push through reforms that would have been otherwise politically and domestically difficult to do. But, and I completely agree with Master Kishore. I think the US should try to return to the table, but not return offering a new game. CPTPP is already there. The rules have been laid out. If the US returns, I think the concern amongst some, perhaps many, who are part of the CPTPP now, is whether the US will undo what has already been agreed on and try to change that game. So return to the game, yes, but the question is on whose terms, whose rules. And I think that's the key question that we in Southeast Asia need to consider. There's agreement. The US should come in, play along as well for the long game, but let's not try to change the whole thing up.
Wonderful. I want to get to a audience question. This is a bit of a specific question, but it did sort of remind me of something. This question is from Renate Breidenthal, and the question is very specific about the position of Vietnam. Now, we don't have somebody, well, all of you are experts in Southeast Asia, but we don't have somebody specifically representing Vietnam here. Nevertheless, Vietnam is an interesting country because it is a large country, one of the larger ones. It has a very strong military. It has faced down China, but nevertheless has a very strong relationship with China. It's also a member of some of these trade pacts, and in fact is a member of the CPTPP as well. An unusual country because it's not one of the wealthier countries in that group. So perhaps Kishore, Elena, Dino, any of you, speak to that. What is Vietnam's model here? And is there something, again, that Americans should know about in terms of how it balances all of this?
Well, let me start, and then maybe Dino and Elena can join in. You're right, Vietnam is a very interesting country. If there's one country that needs to worry about the return of China, I think that country is Vietnam, because Vietnam has been neighbors with China for the past 2,000 years and actually occupied by China only 1,000 years. So as China becomes powerful again, I can well imagine the concern in Hanoi. But at the same time, there's a lot, since the Vietnamese have handled China only for 2,000 years, they also have worked out a strategic culture of how to manage China. And as part of the strategic culture, there's a well-known Vietnamese saying that says that if you want to become leader of Vietnam, you must be able to stand up to China. Yes, but you must also be able to get along with China. And if you cannot do both, you cannot be a leader of Vietnam. So I think that's very, very clear. So the Vietnamese obviously will want to fiercely maintain their independence, but they also realize that they're not going to get rid of China anytime soon. And also the Vietnamese understand the cycles of Chinese history much better than most of us. And the Chinese civilization, as you know, goes up for 200 years, goes down for 200 years. But right now, it's on a 200-year cycle of going up, of which we have seen the first 40 years. The Vietnamese anticipate another 160 years of the Vietnamese civilization becoming stronger, and they have to adapt and so on and so forth. But just very quickly, incidentally, you didn't raise the question, why did Vietnam abstain in the UN on the resolution to condemn Russian invasion of Ukraine? Well, Vietnam still depends on Russia for its defense weaponry. And the Vietnamese also, precisely because they have to balance China, therefore want to keep all their options open, right? And they cannot afford to alienate Moscow. So one thing that Washington, D.C. is not good at is understanding nuance, you know. in Washington, D.C., everything is black or white, black or white, black or white. And that's not what Asia is about. Asia is all about nuances, and Dino and Alina, I think, understand that very well. And for some strange reason, the American mindset just cannot capture these nuances, which I find very troubling. And I hope Quincy can do a good job of educating the Americans on that.
We
Dino,
try.
whether you disagree.
We try. Thank you. I wanted to pick that black and white question up, the stark differences, the stark divides that is very common in the US perception of the world. Sometimes it's a good thing, because when you want to get things done, when you want to tackle a problem, you identify it, you isolate it and solve it. It works in some areas very well, but it does not work in some other areas. And one area that is questionable, at least, is this whole issue of democracies versus autocracies. This issue has now really taken center stage in Washington, both in terms of looking at Russia and China, and indeed as a motivation for designing policy. So I want to ask Dino Jalal this, because you wrote a very interesting article for Foreign Policy. Also, this was, of course, in cooperation with the Asian Peace Program, on what the Biden administration policy should be in China. In fact, the title was, "Can Biden Keep the Peace in Southeast Asia?" And one of the points you made, one of the interesting points you made, was how Southeast Asians are not particularly moved by this geopolitical argument of democracies versus autocracies. So explain that, what you meant by that. And in the 10 months that you wrote this article, has that changed for the better or for the worse?
Well, I refer to the ASEAN process. If ASEAN were to be ideological, ASEAN would never be, right? If ASEAN were to insist on political uniformity, that every member has to be strict democracies and free markets, then ASEAN would never be. And in fact, that's the reason why ASEAN has succeeded, because of the pragmatism, the fact that all you need to do is just to belong to the region. And even if you have different political systems, different ideologies, is totally fine. So that is the recipe of success for ASEAN. So it would be difficult for ASEAN to follow a strategic orientation that is based on, promoting, the values of democracies, although we have that in the ASEAN Charter, right? But to use it in the way that some countries have used it, I think that would be counterproductive, because we don't use it within ASEAN. We don't clobber a country based on that. We certainly don't treat China in that respect. I mean, no one in ASEAN has the strategic ambition to turn China into a democracy, for example, right? That is not our game, and no one is attacking the CCP, right? For example, that is not our game. So we are very careful about the question of values and how that is used as a foreign policy strategy.
Right. This is also a point where I want to get Alina Noor in, because this whole question of democracy and autocracy has a technology component. It, of course, has a normative component and a technology component because of the question of surveillance. Now, we all read about the Chinese state's powerful surveillance capabilities domestically, and many of the abuses that China has been accused of in that arena. But we also read of the private sector and other countries having also enormous power in terms of gathering data and so forth. So tell us how this autocracies versus democracies questions plays in this realm.
I'm not very persuaded at all by this dichotomy that's often drawn between democracies and autocracies. Because if you look at history, even in Southeast Asia, a lot of the let's say, misadventures that were pursued by so-called democratic powers in the name of democracy actually ended up undermining democracy in the region and in other parts of the world. And as you rightly point out, Sarang, in the technological domain, there are many so-called democratic countries that have no qualms supplying surveillance equipment in the name of security to countries in Southeast Asia. There's a lot of focus that's paid to Chinese companies, and certainly there are Chinese companies that are providing these surveillance networks and mechanisms, but the Chinese are really new entrants to this game. The market players, the long-standing market players in Southeast Asia and elsewhere have really been some of the American and the European ones. So I think we should be honest about that. The focus right now is on China because China is the talk of the town. But we often forget that there was an existing ecosystem with all these practices already in place. And that's something that we should keep in mind as we're considering whether something is democratic or a particular power or company coming from a particular country is democratic or autocratic. The last thing I'll say on this is that very often the big competition now is in the governance arena with standards and rules of the road in cyberspace and everything related to technology. The Trump administration had this clean network initiative that was meant to exclude China. CCP was often mentioned. And China responded with its Global Data Security Initiative, which had all the language of inclusivity and multilateralism that actually appealed to many other countries that were not as persuaded by this binary that was drawn. And I think if you look at, again, these UN processes, the group of governmental experts, and the shoot off or the offshoot that came out of this split that I mentioned in 2017, the open-ended working group that's actually meeting next week in New York, the OEWG was meant to be a multilateral open process that was not inclusive as the GGE was. And the OEWG was actually very well received by many, many countries. And it was a Russian proposal. So this whole idea of what is democratic, what is autocratic, the ideas that come from these binaries, I think are really a chimera, and we should be aware of that.
Wonderful. I wanted to pick up a couple of questions, one from Jamal Sheikh and the other from Anna Ashton. Jamal Sheikh speaks of mediation between Russia and Ukraine. This point has come up earlier as well. But Anna Ashton speaks of cooperation, cooperative structures where ASEAN in particular plays a role to bring China and the US in the same room on economic initiatives, on economic projects. So pivoting back to ASEAN as an organization, a very successful organization that has shown coexistence and cooperation. Can ASEAN play this role of trying to suggest, even if they're smaller initiatives, to bring the United States and China in the same room?
Can I start answering?
Yeah, please.
Very quickly, I used to attend ASEAN meetings for 33 years. I guess almost as long as Dino. And what ASEAN does best is put people who have contending positions in a room and then get them to talk to each other. I think that's the genius of ASEAN. And I say, actually, it comes from this Indonesian culture of musyawara and mufakat, consultation and consensus. So when the US and China sit in a room together with ASEAN and other partners, what they will sense immediately is a very subtle kind of invisible peer pressure, which tells them, hey, you guys, you can keep on shouting outside this room, but in this room, you talk to each other. And you tell us how your differences are going to affect all of us, right? And that peer pressure from ASEAN and its partners has actually played a very valuable role in many areas. Just to give you a concrete example, when the United States tries to get South Korea and Japan to sit together and talk to each other, these are the two biggest allies of the United States. The United States cannot get them to sit down and talk to each other. But the same people, South Korea and Japan, you put them in a room of ASEAN and its peers, they get so much peer pressure that actually they sign a free trade agreement with each other under the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So ASEAN has pulled off geopolitical miracles with its culture of consultation and consensus. And this culture is an asset that the United States should learn to utilize if it wants to create stability in this region. So work with ASEAN and don't try to work around ASEAN.
I want to add to that.
Please.
You know, many Indonesian students ask me, why is it so difficult for U.S. and China to talk to one another and to work together, to cooperate? Because within ASEAN, we do that very well, and they can take lesson from ASEAN. You know, you ask what the U.S. can learn from ASEAN countries. Look, Indonesia and Timor-Leste hated each other after 1999. We didn't want anything to do with them, and neither did they, right? But then we started talking, and now we have the best of relations. Remember Vietnam and ASEAN 6? There was so much, suspicions and mistrust or distrust following the Vietnam War, but we reached out, and now Vietnam is a part of the ASEAN family, right? So within ASEAN, there's this pragmatism, there's this culture of cooperation and embracing and outreach that we don't know why is it so difficult for major powers to emulate, you know. So I think that's an interesting angle that many of my students ask me also.
Yeah, that certainly is a very interesting question. And I'm actually going to, maybe this might be our last question, but ASEAN's miracles are well written about and hopefully understood. But yet there's also one wrinkle to that. The fact that ASEAN countries, some of them have territorial contestations or contestations of EEZs with China. And in recent years, we have seen a more assertive Chinese presence. In Indonesia, that's been around the Natuna Islands. With Malaysia, it's been about territorial incursions. Singapore is not a claimant in any of those disputes, but nevertheless, it is a very important part of ASEAN. So how does one try to, just looking at ASEAN-China now, keeping the US out, what is the ASEAN response to this? The code of conduct is one, but really in terms of success, where do you see success in getting that message across to China on its incursions and assertions? And this is, again, maybe we can start with Dino Jalal.
Well, I think the main way to address this is through the ASEAN-China negotiation on the code of conduct. It's obviously being delayed due to the pandemic, but the discussions are progressing. They prefer to discuss things in person rather than online, given the sensitivity of the issue. For the Indonesia side, I think that's one of the key challenge in our relations with China. The economic side is great, the political side is good, but there's this big question of areas that China claims based on its 9-dash line in the northern Natuna. And we've been very clear about this, that this is a sovereignty issue. We don't recognize China's claim. And the President Jokowi is quite firm about this. But somehow this issue has been compartmentalized, meaning that it's being addressed, but without disrupting or affecting the overall bilateral relations. But certainly on that issue, Indonesia is very sensitive and very firm. And we do not recognize China's claim. And that's one area where we push back very hard, saying that China has to resolve issues based on international law, including UNCLOS. And that is also one area that Indonesia has a very strong strategic interests in ensuring freedom of navigation in that area. Yeah. And so that's how we see it.
Elena Noor, any comments?
I mean, just very briefly, I think there's a lot of protestation done and discussions as well behind the scenes that are often underappreciated between the ASEAN countries and China, but it also depends on which ASEAN country you ask, right? Because there are different approaches amongst the Southeast Asian claimant states. And so I think countries will try whatever it is that hopefully will get the message across to China that some of the actions that China is taking in the South China Sea are not at all the mark of a friendly country. And there's no win-win when there are these provocations that are being tested in the South China Sea. So multilateralism is definitely a commitment amongst the ASEAN countries with China. But I think there are also a lot of bilateral efforts that are ongoing and that must continue to be pushed through with China.
Professor Mehbubani, you will have the last word on this.
Well, I agree with Gino that the 9-dash line is very hard to explain under international law. And I think the Chinese themselves must realize, and I said this in one of my books, that the 9-dash line may turn out to be an albatross around the necks of China. And you notice that they, in theory, if the 9-dash line means anything, it should say that all the waters within the 9-dash line are territorial waters of China. But China doesn't claim that. And in fact, China allows freedom of navigation right through the whole South China Sea. So there are some contradictions in the Chinese position on the 9-dash line. But I would say certainly on South China Sea, the wisest thing that China could do is to show greater sensitivity to the concerns of its ASEAN neighbors. And since China is the big player in here, it is really up to China to make more significant compromises to solve the South China Sea issue.
Well, time flies, and we are at the 9 p.m. hour here, and I think it's still earlier in the morning in Southeast Asia. But it's been a fantastic discussion. I could ask you many more questions, but I cannot. So we will have to leave it for another time, another event, and we will have more in this partnership between the Quincy Institute and the Asian Peace Program. We look forward to more events, looking at some of these areas in greater detail. Today, we tried to do a full 360-degree view, economics, technology, geopolitics, and so forth. But we will try to break this down in the coming months. And I hope all of you can join us and participate in this. So thank you very much to all the audience, and thank you to the panelists for sharing your time with us and your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.